In the previous episode, we successfully installed an RHB31 turbocharger onto the Kubota D722 diesel engine in our Saturn coupe. The video mainly emphasizes the fabrication and techniques involved in the custom installation of the turbo, but unfortunately, we didn't have time to do any testing other than the basics. So today we're going to find out how much of an improvement the turbo makes as far as performance and fuel economy goes. At the conclusion of our first test ride, we discovered that the engine bay on the Saturn was a lot hotter than normal. Keep in mind it's winter here in Kansas and the engine bay tends to be cold. Well, the elevated temperature certainly wasn't a huge issue and we could have ignored it. However, we decided to remove the chloroplast that was blocking the airflow to the engine compartment. Now, we only removed half of the chloroplast because the other side blocks the airflow to the radiator, and removing that would cause the engine to run extremely cold. Now, if you're new to this channel, your first thought might be, Jimbo, did you check the thermostat? Yes, I did. Actually, I spent several days fiddling with the cooling system on this car, and this tiny bypass hole in the thermostat is enough to cause the engine to run cold when the radiator is exposed to the airflow. We could certainly plug this bypass hole, but blocking the airflow to the radiator allows us to keep our options open. Be mindful of the fact that this Saturn didn't come from the factory with a little Kubota diesel engine. As it happens, we had to engineer and custom build everything in order to get the car to go down the road. Anyway, we had to do a lot of problem solving, and when possible, we go with simple and low-cost solutions that a lot of people can relate to. If you're interested, I encourage our newer viewers to go back and watch previous episodes in order to understand how this car evolved. Now at this point, we're ready to evaluate how much of a difference the turbo makes, but before we hit the road, let me remind the viewers of some key points from previous episodes. In our quest to get the car to go faster, we experimented with the rack adjustment on the fuel injector pump, and so far we've been bouncing between 32 and 33 millimeter. At 32 millimeter, we get an enormous boost in power, but the exhaust gas temperatures skyrocket at full throttle under a load. Now at 33 millimeter, we get a modest boost in power, and the exhaust gas temperatures are manageable, but can quickly get out of hand. In theory, the boost from the turbocharger should pump enough additional air into the engine and lean out the air-fuel mixture to reduce the exhaust gas temperatures. Bear in mind, we're dealing with a diesel engine and not a gasoline engine. Right now, this engine desperately needs more air to balance out the air-fuel mixture. The injector pump is set to 33 millimeter, and prior to adding the turbocharger, this setting provided a modest increase in power with manageable exhaust gas temperatures. Unfortunately, we don't have any performance data with this setting before we added the turbo. I reckon we need to do an acceleration run and get some baseline data. Another thing I need to mention is, right now the turbo is producing only 5 pounds of boost. Not much, but later on in this video we'll dial in more boost because, well, turbo. For the folks who are concerned, here's the weather and test data. Now on this acceleration test, we'll do our typical 0 to 55 mile per hour, and then we'll also get the time for the more standard 0 to 60 miles per hour. The time to beat is 40 seconds, and that was done with the injector pump adjusted to 32 millimeter. Right now we're at 33, but we also have a turbo. This should be interesting. So with the injector pump dialed back to 33 millimeter, the engine's getting less fuel and making less power. However, with the turbo, we managed to get to 55 miles per hour in 41.54 seconds. So that's about 2 seconds slower than our best time. 60 miles per hour takes a while to get to, but we got there in 53.72 seconds. The car ain't fast, that's for sure, but after we do some more fiddling, I think you folks may be surprised. After doing the acceleration run, we topped off the fuel tank and set out to do the fuel economy run. Now, previously we were able to get 59 miles per gallon from this 3-cylinder 719cc engine. Of course, that's driving around the back roads of rural Kansas. Anyway, we tried to keep the speed around 60 miles per hour, give or take, and at the end of the fuel economy run we did our calculations and it turns out the fuel economy is more or less the same, although technically it's a fraction less. One of the interesting benefits of the turbo is the exhaust gas temperature never went above 1000 degrees Fahrenheit no matter what we did. So if nothing else, the turbo certainly helped out in that regard. Well, the 5 psi boost is a disappointment, but not for long. The wastegate on this turbo is fully adjustable by changing the springs and modifying the preload. I think for now we'll keep the current spring and just crank up on the wastegate preload. I believe this should bump the boost somewhere near 8 psi. Now that we're under the hood of the car, let's dial in some more fuel by adjusting the fuel rack. Now we'll fast forward this just a little bit. The fuel rack was adjusted several times and we finally settled on 31.5mm, which is a bit more than we normally run. However, the engine seemed to tolerate this fine and we still had a visibly clean exhaust. The only downside to this setting was the exhaust gas temperatures were creeping up again at full throttle. Before we take off and do some more testing, let's take a look at the robot Cantina scientifically generated performance scale. Unfortunately, the Saturn still performs like a fully loaded garbage truck. Now, our goal is somewhere in this area. I reckon everybody recognizes this iconic shape, and of course it's a Volkswagen Beetle. Certainly not the fastest car ever built, but back in the day these were very popular. I even had one when I lived in New York. As I recall, I paid $1 for the car and $5 for the battery. So basically I gave $6 for a 1964 Volkswagen Beetle. Now that was a long time ago and I'm sure prices have gone up significantly. Performance on these old Beetles can vary a lot, so let's define our goal with some historical data. Ah yes, okay, so a 64 Beetle with a fresh 1200cc engine and with a curb weight of 1,600 pounds could, if pushed hard enough, get you up to 60 miles per hour in a mere 29.5 seconds. Now let's look at some Saturn data. What we have here is a 1999 Saturn coupe with a 3-cylinder 719cc diesel motor. The transmission we're using is a close ratio Saturn MP3, and that helps the little diesel engine accelerate as fast as possible while still having an overdrive in 5th gear. The car has had a few unnecessary parts removed and currently tips the scale at 2,080 pounds. What we don't know is how much power the engine actually makes. The Kubota D722 engine is rated for 20 horsepower when it left the factory, but after fiddling with the injector pump and adding a turbo, well, we really don't know how much it's making now. Possibly 30 horsepower and a bunch of torque, but that's pure speculation. Alright, let's see how this car performs. And here's the weather and test data for the folks who are concerned. So with about 8 psi of boost and a little bit more fuel, we made a huge improvement. Now as far as 0 to 60 goes, well, we're a few seconds slower than a stock 64 Volkswagen Bug, but hear me out. You see, back in the day, Volkswagens were popular with the hippies, and we could say our diesel-powered Saturn is just as fast, if not faster, than a Volkswagen full of hippies on their way to Woodstock. I realize it may seem like a stretch, but it's a scientific fact, like it or not. Anyway, the data puts us right about here on the performance scale, and we really need to be here. We might be able to do it with a little bit more boost, but I'm not sure how much more this engine can be pushed. Speaking about boost, let's take a look at the boost gauge while we drive the car on a fuel economy run. It's very satisfying to hear a turbo spool up on a diesel engine and to see boost being produced. I reckon the diesel crowd knows what I'm talking about. Anyway, fuel economy runs are the worst part of testing these Frankenstein cars, and that's due to the lack of power. This time around, the car wasn't that bad. It seemed to have plenty of power, all things considered. Let's take a look at the data we collected today. Way back in episode whatever, we finally managed to get the car up to 55 miles per hour. It took 1 minute and 6 long seconds to get there. Then we threw caution into the wind and bumped the fuel rack to 32mm and got the car up to 55 miles per hour in a quick 40 seconds. Well, she was making power, but the exhaust gas temperatures were crazy high, so we backed off on the fuel. However, at this point, we don't have any performance data for the 0 to 55 with the rack adjusted to 33mm. Next, we added a turbocharger and initially set it up to make 5 psi of boost. So with the turbo and a reasonable fuel setting, the car got up to 55 miles per hour in 41.54 seconds. It's better than walking. Alright, now here's where it starts to get interesting. We bumped the boost up to about 8 psi and adjusted the fuel rack to 31.5mm. At this point, we still had visibly clean exhaust, and the car responded by getting up to 55 miles per hour in 29.5 seconds. A short while later, we hit 60 miles per hour in 34.54 seconds. Now clearly we need more boost, but keep in mind this engine wasn't built to handle a turbo, and we really don't know what the limits are. Also, I mentioned the exhaust gas temperature 7 times in this video, and that's because once again this engine wasn't built for the things we're doing to it. Anyway, something to consider is the piston rings on this engine do not have the proper ring gap for a turbo, and the elevated exhaust gas temperatures can cause the rings to bind, which will result in significant engine damage. I think at this point we need to cautiously move forward with some more experiments. Let's take a look at how the fuel economy is progressing. So this car was not built with fuel economy in mind, but it seems to deliver some pretty good numbers. On our very first attempt to record fuel economy, we got 56.66 miles to the gallon. It's interesting to note that we got that more or less while driving foot to the floor in 4th gear. You see, at the time, the engine didn't have enough power to get into 5th gear. With the injector pump set to 33mm, we got more power and we were able to drive in 5th gear, and that resulted in a high water mark of 59.36 miles to the gallon. Next, we added a turbo that was adjusted to make 5 psi of boost, and the fuel economy dropped slightly and we got 58.40 miles to the gallon, which still ain't bad. Now with the turbo modified to deliver about 8 psi and the fuel rack adjusted to 31.5mm, well, that really changed the personality of the car. However, the fuel economy suffered slightly and we got 58.05 miles to the gallon. Now I'm sure in a Mad Max post-apocalyptic dystopia setting, the car could be coached into getting better fuel economy if it was driven differently, but that's not realistic. Modifying and testing this car takes both time and good weather for driving. We've had several cold and windy days recently, so we took a break from the Saturn and started working on the diesel-swapped Honda Insight. At this stage, we're designing the motor mounts and working on the shift linkages. Now, we definitely have a lot more experiments to do on the Saturn, but someday soon we'll start publishing the Honda Insight diesel swap videos. If you're not subscribed already, well, now would be a good time to do so. It really helps this channel out a lot, and it guarantees you won't miss any future episodes. I think I'll end this video with a slideshow of all the cars I owned when I was a stupid teenager. I was quite the wheeler dealer back in those days.